The real estate listing said 50 acres of unimproved land. That was a polite way of saying 50 acres of kudzu. The photographs in the listing showed what kudzu looks like when it's had 5 years to do what kudzu does without anyone stopping it. A solid green wall, no ground visible, no trees visible. Not because there were no trees, but because the vine had climbed every trunk and covered every canopy and turned 50 acres of Randolph County, North Carolina, into what looked like a green tarp thrown over a landscape that nobody remembered was underneath. The previous owner was a woman named Alma. She'd lived on the property until 2019 when she died at 89. For 60 years, Alma had kept the kudzu cut back with a bush hog and a stubbornness that the vine couldn't outgrow. When she died, the property went to a nephew in Charlotte who'd never set foot on it. He let it sit. 5 years of nobody mowing. 5 years of kudzu doing what kudzu does at a foot per day in summer. Climbing, covering, swallowing. What Alma had held back for 6 decades consumed the property in less than one. The listing had been active for 14 months. The asking price had dropped 3 times, from $45,000 to $35,000 to $28,000. At $28,000, $560 an acre. The land was priced below the county average for raw ground by nearly 40%. Because nobody wanted 50 acres of kudzu. Nobody except Warren Polk. Warren was 47. He'd been running a small cow-calf operation on 62 acres outside of Asheboro for 12 years. Commercial cattle, 26 Angus cross cows and a bull named Deacon, on pasture that was adequate but tight. 26 cows on 62 acres in the Piedmont of North Carolina is possible but not comfortable. The grass stays short. The hay bill stays high. And every dry August, Warren looked at his stocking rate the way a man looks at a credit card balance that's technically not overdrawn, but feels like it. He needed more ground. Ground in Randolph County was running $800 to $1,200 an acre for cleared pasture. 50 acres of pasture would cost $40,000 to $60,000. Money Warren didn't have. 50 acres of kudzu cost $28,000. Money Warren barely had, but had. His neighbor Leon Chandler told him he was crazy. Leon was 68, ran cattle on the adjoining property, had been watching the kudzu parcel consume itself for 2 decades from the comfort of a fence line that he sprayed with herbicide every spring to keep the vine from crossing onto his ground. Warren, you can't graze kudzu. You can't fence kudzu. You can't do anything with kudzu except spray it, and even that doesn't work because it comes back faster than you can kill it. That land is worthless. That's why it's been listed for 14 months. Warren looked at the green wall across the road. You're right about one thing, Leon. Nobody's been able to kill it. He paused. But I'm not trying to kill it. I'm trying to eat it. Warren closed on the property in March. $28,000. Financed through the Farm Service Agency at 3.5% over 20 years. Monthly payment, $162. Less than his cell phone bill. He spent April building fence, not around the entire 50 acres. That would have required finding the property lines under a blanket of vine that was 10 feet deep in places. He fenced a 5-acre section along the road frontage where the kudzu was thinnest and the terrain was flat enough to work. Then he put Deacon in. Deacon was a 6-year-old Angus bull, 1,300 pounds. He'd been eating grass his entire life. Fescue, orchard grass, the standard Piedmont mix that grows on every farm in Randolph County. He'd never seen kudzu, never tasted it, had no context for a 5-acre paddock where the forage wasn't growing out of the ground, but hanging from every surface like green curtains in an abandoned theater. Deacon stood at the gate for 10 minutes, looking at the kudzu, smelling it, processing something that his digestive system had no file for. Then he bit it. The first bite was tentative, the way cattle bite anything unfamiliar. Lips first, then teeth. Then the decision that happens in the first 3 seconds of chewing when the rumen sends a signal to the brain that says either keep going or spit it out. Deacon kept going. Kudzu is 14 to 18% crude protein, comparable to alfalfa. The leaves are palatable. The stems are digestible when young. The vine is essentially a high-protein forage crop that nobody planted, nobody fertilizes, and nobody harvests, because the agricultural establishment classified it as a weed in 1953 and spent the next 70 years trying to eradicate it instead of asking whether anything useful could be done with it. Deacon ate kudzu for 6 hours the first day, head buried in the vine, pulling leaves and stems with the rhythmic intensity of an animal that has discovered a buffet in a building he didn't know was a restaurant. By the end of the first week, the 5-acre paddock was visibly different. The kudzu canopy, which had been a solid green ceiling 8 feet above the ground, was torn open in patches where Deacon had pulled the vine down to eat it. Sunlight was reaching the ground for the first time in years, and beneath the kudzu, Warren could see what the vine had been hiding. The first thing he found was a fence. Not his fence, an old fence. Cedar posts, hand-split, gray with age, still standing because cedar resists rot for 50 to 80 years depending on soil conditions. Woven wire stapled to the posts, rusted but intact. The fence of a property that had been managed by someone a long time ago, before the kudzu came. Warren pushed through the torn kudzu to the fence line, followed it. The posts were spaced 8 feet apart, consistent, the work of someone who knew fencing. The wire was a gauge and pattern that Warren recognized from old farm supply catalogs, pre-1960s manufacture. This fence had been standing for at least 60 years under a blanket of vine. He moved Deacon through 3 more paddocks over the next 6 weeks. Each time the bull cleared the canopy, more of the buried landscape emerged. A stone wall running east-west across the property, hand-laid field stone, the kind that Piedmont farmers built before machinery made it cheaper to push rocks into piles than stack them into walls. A foundation, rectangular, 20 by 30 feet, the footprint of a building that had stood and fallen and been swallowed. And trees, not kudzu-covered trees, actual trees, standing beneath the canopy in the strange half-light that kudzu creates when it climbs a tree but doesn't completely smother it. The tree surviving in a dim green tunnel, growing slowly, pushing upward just fast enough to keep its crown above the vine's advancing edge. Warren didn't recognize them at first. They weren't pine, weren't oak, weren't hickory or maple or any of the native hardwoods that grow in the Piedmont. They were broad-leafed, deciduous, with a branching pattern that was structured, not wild. The architecture of trees that had been pruned at some point in their lives by someone who knew what shape they wanted. He counted them as Deacon cleared each paddock, row after row, spaced 20 feet apart, east-west rows with north-south alleys between them. The geometry of a planting, not a forest. Warren called his wife Patty from the field. Patty, there are trees under the kudzu, and they're in rows. Rows, rows, like somebody planted them, 20 feet apart. They go on as far as I can see under the vine. Patty drove out. They walked together through the cleared sections. Deacon grazing behind them, still pulling kudzu with the contentment of an animal that had been given an all-you-can-eat pass to a restaurant that never closes. They counted 43 trees in the first 3 paddocks, all alive, all in rows, all showing the growth patterns of cultivated fruit trees, central leaders, scaffold branches, the structural evidence of pruning that had happened decades ago and then stopped when the person doing the pruning stopped coming. Warren pulled a leaf from the nearest tree, broad, serrated edge, dark green with a lighter underside. The shape was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He drove to the Randolph County Extension office the next morning, walked in with a branch, 3 leaves, and a small hard green fruit he'd found on the ground beneath one of the trees. The extension agent was a woman named Denise Faulkner, 53. She'd been in the position for 18 years and had a particular expertise in heritage agriculture. The crops and practices that Piedmont farmers used before the modern era standardized everything into corn, soybeans, and fescue. Denise looked at the branch, looked at the leaves, cut the small green fruit in half with a pocket knife. She looked up at Warren with the expression of someone who has just been handed something she didn't expect to see on a Tuesday morning in a county extension office. Mr. Polk, do you know what this is? A fruit tree. That's all I know. This is a persimmon, but not a wild persimmon. This is a grafted cultivar. She pointed to the base of the branch where a slight bulge indicated the graft union, the point where a desirable fruiting variety had been joined to a hardy rootstock by human hands. This variety Denise turned the fruit in her hand. "I'd need to see it ripe to be certain, but the leaf shape and the fruit size suggest it's either an early golden or a Miller. Both are heritage American persimmon cultivars that were widely planted in the Piedmont from the 1880s through the 1930s. She looked at Warren. "How many trees?" 43 so far, and I've only cleared about 15 acres. There could be more." Denise set down the fruit. "These trees are old, decades old. Somebody planted them, probably in the 20s or 30s, and somebody maintained them for a very long time. The pruning scars on the branches are from years of careful management. Whoever owned this land before the Kudzu took over, they knew what they had." Warren thought about Alma Jarrett, 89 years old when she died. She'd kept the Kudzu back for 60 years. She'd been maintaining the orchard her entire life without anyone outside the property knowing it existed. When she died, the Kudzu covered in 5 years what she'd protected for 6 decades. "These cultivars are rare," Denise continued. "Most of the heritage persimmon orchards in the Piedmont were abandoned during the Second World War when labor left the farms. Without maintenance, Kudzu covered them within a decade, and the trees died. But these trees survived because someone, Alma, kept the vine off them until 5 years ago. 5 years of Kudzu coverage stresses a mature tree severely, but doesn't always kill it. Especially persimmons, which are remarkably shade-tolerant and can survive reduced light longer than most fruit species." She looked at Warren. "If your trees had been under Kudzu for 10 years, they'd be dead. 5 years. They're damaged, stressed, thin-crowned, but alive. You found them just in time." Warren stood in the extension office holding a branch from a tree that someone had planted nearly 100 years ago. On land that someone farmed and someone maintained, and someone died and left to a nephew who let the Kudzu cover it in 5 years and listed it for $28,000 because the listing said unimproved and nobody thought to ask what was under the vine. He drove home, walked to the field where Deacon was still eating kudzu, with the dedication of an animal that had found his purpose. Stood beside his bull and looked at the rows of trees emerging from the vine as Deacon cleared paddock after paddock. An orchard, a forgotten orchard, planted nearly 100 years ago by hands that are gone on land that the world forgot, hidden by a vine that everyone wanted to kill, revealed by a bull that everyone said was wasting his time on worthless ground. Denise brought a team from NC State the following month. Dr. Raymond Suggs, a pomologist specializing in heritage fruit genetics, examined the trees, took tissue samples, identified 7 distinct persimmon cultivars across what ultimately proved to be 71 surviving trees on the 50-acre parcel. 3 of the cultivars had not been documented in a living specimen in North Carolina since a USDA survey in 1987. 1, a variety Suggs tentatively identified as Killen, a cultivar developed in Chatham County in the 1890s, had been considered lost entirely. The trees had survived because Alma Jarrett had protected them for 60 years, and because persimmons are among the most shade-tolerant fruit trees in North America. 5 years of kudzu coverage had stressed them, but not killed them. The vine canopy had actually insulated the trees from late frost damage during the winters, and the nitrogen-fixing root system of the kudzu had been fertilizing the soil around the trees during the 5 years it grew unchecked. Alma's 60 years of maintenance kept the orchard alive. The kudzu's 5 years of coverage nearly killed it, and Deacon the bull arrived just before the timeline ran out. Because another year or 2 of full coverage would have finished what 5 couldn't, Warren found them in the last window. Warren didn't process that immediately. It took him a few days to sit with it. The orchard had been there the entire time. Alma had protected it her entire life. Nobody in the county knew. Nobody asked. Nobody looked. And when she died, 5 years of kudzu nearly erased 60 years of her work. If Warren had waited 2 more years to buy the property, the trees would have been gone. The cultivars would have been lost. The Killen variety that Dr. Suggs thought was extinct would have actually become extinct, not because of disease or drought or development, but because an old woman died and nobody knew what she'd been protecting. Leon Chandler came over when he heard. stood at the fence line that he'd been spraying with herbicide every spring to keep the kudzu off his property, looked at the rows of persimmon trees standing in the cleared sections of Warren's land, their canopies opening to sunlight for the first time in decades, small green fruit forming on branches that hadn't produced a full crop since the Kennedy administration. Leon looked at the trees, then at Deacon grazing in the kudzu, then at Warren. You bought 50 acres of kudzu for $28,000. Yep. And under the kudzu was a persimmon orchard that's been there since the 20s. That's what NC State says, and your bull found it by eating the vine. Warren looked at Deacon. He didn't find it. He uncovered it. The orchard was always there. The bull just ate what was on top. Leon was quiet. The quiet of a 68-year-old man who has been spraying the border of his property for 20 years to keep out a plant that was apparently preserving something priceless on the other side of the fence. Warren spent the following year managing the transition. Deacon continued clearing kudzu, rotating through paddocks, eating the vine faster than it could regrow because continuous grazing pressure on kudzu prevents the root system from replenishing its carbohydrate reserves. The vine weakened. The trees emerged. By the end of the first full year, all 71 trees were exposed. Warren pruned the dead wood, opened the canopies, let the Piedmont sun do what the persimmons had been waiting 70 years for it to do. The first real crop came the second fall. Heritage persimmons. Orange gold fruit the size of a small tomato, soft when ripe, with a sweetness that Warren described to Patty as like someone mixed honey and brown sugar and a smell I can't name but my grandmother would have recognized. Patty started selling them at the farmer's market in Ashboro. $2 a pound. The fruit sold out every Saturday by 9:30 in the morning. Customers who'd never tasted a heritage persimmon came back the next week with their mothers, who had tasted them. 50 years ago, on a grandmother's farm, before the orchards disappeared and the grocery stores replaced them with imported Asian persimmons that taste like nothing and cost $4 each. The heritage fruit movement found Warren. Articles in regional farming magazines. A feature in a North Carolina agricultural heritage publication. NC State included the orchard in their heritage fruit preservation program. Scion wood from the Killen variety, the one considered lost, was grafted onto rootstock at the university's research farm, ensuring that the genetics would survive even if Warren's trees didn't. Warren's 50 acres now produces 2 income streams. The cattle operation, Deacon and the 26 cows, now grazing kudzu-managed pasture that didn't exist 18 months ago, and the persimmon harvest, which brought in $11,000 in its first full season from fruit that had been growing under a vine that nobody thought was worth looking under. Total cost of discovering a heritage orchard that the scientific community had given up on, $28,000 for the land, $162 a month in payments, and a bull that liked the taste of kudzu. Leon stopped spraying his fence line last spring. He told Warren, "I've been poisoning that vine for 20 years. Now I'm wondering what it was protecting on my side that I killed before I could find it." Warren looked at his neighbor. "You'll never know. That's the cost of spraying before looking." Deacon stands in the orchard most afternoons now. The kudzu is under control. Not gone. It will never be gone. But managed by continuous grazing pressure that keeps it below the tree canopy. The persimmon branches hang over the bull's back as he grazes the vine beneath them. Fruit falling around him in October like orange ornaments, dropping from a ceiling he created by eating the curtain that was hiding it. Patty told Warren on a Sunday evening last fall, "You bought 50 acres that everybody said was worthless. Put a bull on it. The bull ate the vine. The vine was hiding an orchard that nobody knew existed. The orchard produces fruit that people's grandmothers remember. And the whole thing started because you couldn't afford real pasture." Warren looked at her. "Sometimes the thing you can afford teaches you more than the thing you can't. Some land isn't worthless. Some land is just waiting for someone to look under what's covering it. And some bulls, given a vine that nobody wanted on ground that nobody valued, will eat their way to something that everybody forgot was there. Because the ground remembers what was planted on it, even when the people don't.